Okay, so first I'd like to thank the organizer for their kind invitation to speak in this seminar. I was very glad, and I hope you'll excuse my very French accent and that you'll understand me. So my communication today will deal with brothers and sisters during the early Middle Ages, which is, as Rachel said, the title of my book, very recently published by Brepols, and which is a slightly abbreviated version of my PhD thesis, which I defended, as she said, in 2021 under the supervision of Professor Geneviève Buretier. In this communication, I'd like to underline some of the key points I made in this book. I first present the scope of the study, the sources, and so on. Then I show what is a sibling during the early Middle Ages, which is not as simple as it sounds. And then I show the articulation between some missing topics, such as twins, and the idealization of the sibling bond. So, first, my work deals with family during the early Middle Ages, and as such, it is part of a very dynamic French historiography initiated long ago, and which was later conceptualized by the work of Régine Lejean, Famille et pouvoir dans le monde franc, Family and Power in the Frankish World. Régine Lejean made a synthesis between the historical anthropology developed by French medievalists since the 70s and German prosopography and Adelsforschung. She studied the structures of the family during the early Middle Ages, and in particular, she showed that the family was not a large unit, but was based on nuclear family made by a couple and their children. Since then, a lot of Lejean students worked on these themes. More recently, some of them got interested in some particular relation inside of the structure of the family. Sylvie Joie worked on the fatherly figure, and Emmanuel Santinelli-Fols worked on the couples and conjugality for habilitation. Her book, which you can see, was published after I defended my thesis, but her former work dealt with it too. So my work is part of this recent revival, which aims to highlight some understudied links inside the structure in the family. Indeed, siblings appear as a parent pauvre of the history of the family, according to the word of Didier. The interest in them is very recent. It could be easily understood if we keep in mind the strong influence of structural anthropology on French medieval history, because they were inspired by Claude Lévi-Strauss, French medievalists used to study the structures and, in particular, filiation and alliance. There was no place for some horizontal links, even when they derive from filiation and alliance, which is the case with siblings. Moreover, my work is part of the dynamic field of gender history. Siblings' relationships are a very convenient way to study gender inside the family, as it is conceived by the medieval author of this period as the only non-sexual relationship between a man and a woman. Moreover, the sources of the early Middle Ages dealt almost exclusively with the aristocracy, and in this social group, women were given very important tasks. When they were married, they had to be the link between their in-laws and their brothers. When they were put in monasteries, they had to pray for their family, and they helped to shape the territory and the memory of the aristocracy. So I tried, whenever it was possible, to integrate sisters in the study, even if they were very much more difficult to uncover than their brothers. Moreover, one of the particularities of my work is that I chose, as suggested by my supervisor Geneviève Buretier, to deal not only with Frankish Gaul and Germany, but also with the English realms. The French historiography on early medieval England is not very vivid, and my point was to integrate this space in order to make some comparisons. It was actually very interesting, especially about the problem of succession inside the royal family, which is more often a succession between brothers than between a father and a son in England. And because of the inclusion of England, the period under study started in the middle of the 7th century, because the first charters made in England dated back from this period. Which leads me to the documentation I used to study siblings. I decided to use every source I could find on the subject. My first aim was to use narrative documents and charters in order to have a more complete vision of the sibling bond. But then I integrated other materials such as letters, treaties, and so on. I gave a few numbers on the slides. I used 58 narrative sources such as Annals and Chronicles, 80 lives of saints, and 6 biographies of kings, such as Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, and Alfred. And concerning diplomatic documentation, I used more than 1,050 and 500, sorry, numbers are very difficult, charters, royal and non-royal, who mention siblings. I also used some objects and images when needed. For instance, I will start with the cover of the book, which is a wonderful enamel, which was on a cross made at the request of Abbess Matilda of Essen shortly after the death of her brother, Duke Otto of Swabia. They are both represented on the enamel. The two siblings are depicted as equals. They wear matching costumes, and the scene is supposed to represent the transmission of the memory inside of the family. Indeed, Otto and Matilda were the grandchildren of Emperor Otto I and his first wife, Edith. The untimely death of Otto, childless, at the end of the 10th century, doomed this branch of the family to extinction, and the so-called Otto and Matilda cross is a beautiful depiction of the collaboration of a brother and a sister to maintain the memory of this branch of the family. So images and objects could show some things which are not seen in the text. Otto and Matilda were siblings born from the same parents, but in reality, the definition of siblings is not always so easy. First, the Latin vocabulary is very complex. As with words meaning father, mother, or husband and wife, there are several ways to say brother and sister. In classical Latin, Germanus or Germana means a biological brother or sister, whereas frater or soror is also used for social siblings. This connotation still existed during the early Middle Ages. But there were also some important changes. First, Germanus and Germana was the dominant form in the 7th century, but it became a minority of occurrences during the 10th. The shift occurred at the end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 9th in Francia. But there were some important differences according to the spaces and the sources. In England, for instance, even in the 7th century, the couple made by frater and soror was dominant. It was probably due to the influence of Old English and vernacular tongue, in which there was no difference between biological and social siblings. The term used being brodor, brother, and swester, sister. Moreover, in hagiographic texts, Germanus and Germana remained very frequently used. Approximately 20% of the vocabulary denoting sibling bonds was made of this word, Germanus, Germana. The author of the Lives of the Saints needed to highlight the differences between biological and spiritual kinship, so they kept using this word. Indeed, with very few exceptions due to literary style, Germanus and Germana remained used exclusively for biological links, whereas frater and soror could be used to express spiritual Christian kinship. However, it could also be used to highlight other familial bonds in certain circumstances. I will take just one example of what anthropologists call classificatory kinship. Classificatory kinship, as opposed to descriptive kinship, give the same name, here frater or soror, to relatives who do not have the same genealogical position. It's very clear in the Ottonian family at the end of the 10th century, as you can see. I will explain what is on the screen. Because Otto II had in the center of the slide called his nephew, Duke Otto of Swabia. The same was depicted on the enamel I showed earlier. He called him frater in several diplomas. Some of them are still preserved as originals, so it is not an error made by a later copyist. The two Ottos were very close. They were almost the same age and they grew up together. Calling his nephew a brother, a frater, was for the emperor a way to express this proximity. But more surprisingly, other diplomas issued by Otto III, his son, or by his mother Teophano when he was a kid, also called other cousins, Henry the Quarrelsome and his son, the future emperor Henry II. He called him brothers, frater. This branch of the family, the Henrys, was opposed to the Ottos and they rebelled several times. However, the term brother was used when they were in good terms with Otto III, and it may be considered as a way to show that they were worthy of the family and maybe worthy of the throne. Brother was used to call the closest male kin and maybe an heir apparent. And finally, when he became king, Henry II also called his cousins Sophia and Adelaide, Otto III's sisters, his sisters, his sorores, in several diplomas. His legitimacy was contested, and it was a way for him to underline his proximity with the precedent king and to enhance his right to the throne. So the vocabulary was consciously used by some to underline some political or familial issues. Surprisingly, though, it was rarely used to make differences between children born from another parent. Half-brothers and half-sisters were generally called Germanus or frater and soror. It's more ambiguous for adoptive siblings because adoption was quite rare. It seems, however, that the distinction between biological siblings and adoptive ones was quite clear. But in some cases, the parents wanted to make sure their adoptive children were recognized. In the 9th century life of Saint Liudberga, the Dame Gisela commanded her son, Count Bernard, to protect his sisters, but also to take care of her adoptive daughter, Liudberga. I showed the citation of the quotation on the screen, and to count her among your sisters and to love her. This very rare example shows that maybe adoptive children were not recognized as full siblings. The passage also underlines the importance of parents and education in the formation of the sibling bond. Parents seemed to encourage the good relationships between their children, in particular by educating them together or associating them to their decisions. Of course, this implication of the parents also depends on the size of the sibling group. It is quite difficult to estimate the number of children per woman during the early Middle Ages. Maybe 3 or 4 children per couple lived long enough to become adult. So I decided to look at other factors and in particular at the number of siblings intervening together in the sources. The results were quite interesting because in narrative sources as well as in charters, the average number of siblings here is 2 or 3, even if we know that the group was bigger. The table on the screen is in French, but you can see that in the corpus of English charters, in the which is the second column. In the charters of Singal, the third column, and in the charters of Cluny, so in England, South Germany, and Burgundy, the siblings, the French word is Adelph, appear in group of 2 in 70% of the cases. It is the same thing. I won't develop because I won't have time in the narrative sources, such as in Bede or in Asser or in the English Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it's the same on the continent. However, in most of the cases, the 2 siblings were men. In the charters, the sex ratio between brother and sisters is 9.5, with important differences between the Anglo-Saxon charters, in which the sex ratio is approximately 4, and the Cluniac charters, in which it is approximately 13. This extremely unbalanced sex ratio is not, of course, representative of the demographic reality of medieval populations. It's more the sign of the relative absence of sisters in land transactions and donations to religious institutions. The groups constituted only by sisters are extremely rare in the sources. If the sources represented the siblings in small groups, most of the time made of 2 people, it would be logical to expect the frequent mention of twins. In the pre-modern period, twins represented 1 or 2% of the birth. They were frequent figures in antique mythologies or in the novels of the second half of the Middle Ages. However, they were quasi-absent from the documentation of the early Middle Ages. There are fewer than 10 cases in the sources I used. 3 of the documented cases involved twin birth that resulted in the death of one of the children. At the end of the 8th century, Queen Hildegard, wife of Charlemagne, gave birth to 2 sons, the future Louis the Pious and Lothar died shortly afterwards. At the end of the 9th century, an anonymous noblewoman gave birth to twins, one of whom died, but the other was saved by Saint Walburga. And in the middle of the 10th century, Queen Gerberga, wife of Louis IV of Francia, gave birth to 2 sons, Charles and Henry, but only Charles survived. In this case, the authors were concerned by royal genealogies and the intercession of saints in the misfortunes of mother. In general, twin births in themselves are not the subject of particular comment, except maybe in the Annals of Quedlinburg at the beginning of the 11th century, because the annalist mentioned a monstrous twin birth, but the description corresponds more precisely to what we would call conjoined twins than just twins. Some lives of saints, especially on the second half of the 9th century, also asserted that the saints were twins. Saint Benedict of Nursia and his sister Scholastic, Saint Opportuna and her brother, Cradogang, Bishop of Se, and Médard and Godard. But these saints are very shadowy figures, and some of them, like Godard, are totally legendary. We can just note a brief interest in twin saints in northern Gaul during the second half of the 9th century. So, twins were not a recurring literary or artistic motif. Even if in the very rare iconography of twins, this point is often missing. The legendary founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, were represented with their adoptive mother, the she-wolf, but it was most of the time a discourse about Romanitas and not about twins. It is even more striking with the twin saints Cosmas and Damian. They were early Christian martyrs, and they were quite popular during the early Middle Ages. For the period under study, the English writer Audebrand, at the end of the 7th century, is the only one to mention that they were twins, as you can see on the screen. even if this fact was well attested and also known to, for instance, Gregory of Tours. Of the 14 mentions of Cosmas and Damian in the diplomas of Otto I, Otto III, and Henry II, notably in Acts referring to the monastery of Essen, which was dedicated to them, none of these diplomas mentioned their family relationship. Flodoa also mentioned them, but only as martyrdom. Alcuin mentioned their brotherhood, but they are only brother, Germany, and fratres, and not twins. The rare depictions of the saints are in the same vein. If we enlarge the scope of this study, we can see 4 images of Cosmas and Damian during the early Middle Ages. The first one is the impressive mosaic in the Santi Cosma e Damiano Basilica in Rome, which was made in the 6th century. The 2 saints are introduced to Christ by Saint Paul on the left and Saint Peter on the right. The other 2 figures are Pope Felix VI, founder of the Basilica on the left, and Saint Theodore. We can also see a dedication scene in an Essen sacramentary from the middle of the 10th century, in which the twin saints are not represented as twins. We also know an image in a no lost manuscript commissioned by Abbess Hadwig of Essen at the same time. Essen was dedicated to the saints. And finally, we know the cover of the Gospel of Abbess Theophano of Essen in the middle of the 11th century. Also, although the construction of the images parallels the 2 saints in all of the images, they are always individualized and they do not appear as double. It's clear here they don't have the same face structure, and it is also very visible here. They don't have the same hair. One has a round hair and the other not. Moreover, the copy of Hadwig manuscript is the only one which mentions the relationship between the 2 men, and only as Germany, not Gemini, which is the Latin word meaning twins. Without the inscriptions and the context of the images, it would probably be impossible to say that they were twins. The question of twin saints raises the broader issue of legendary or biblical twins. In the Bible, the archetypal example is that of the enemy twins Esau and Jacob, but the text placed more emphasis on the question of the birthright than on the common birth. And it was also the question that preoccupied Carolingian exegetes. The quasi-absence of twins is quite surprising in itself, but it goes with other missing elements. Historians working on siblings also underline the importance of 2 other themes, incest and fratricide, but as with twins, they are very rare in the early medieval sources. Concerning incest, in the 3rd book of the poem in honor of King Louis the Pious, written by Hermod the Black at the beginning of the 9th century, Lambert, Count of Nantes, tells Louis about the customs of the people of Brittany. He asserts that they are Christian in name only, that they are like wild beasts, that they have no regard for children, widows, or churches, and as a supreme horror, that brothers and sisters share the same bed. As you can see on the screen, coeunt frater et ipsa soror. Here, incest is, like the other elements of the enumeration, a way to emphasize the barbarity of the Breton people, as opposed, of course, to the good morals of the Frankish people. In contrast to the just affection that should unite siblings, incest is seen as a sign of a breakdown in the family structure. Incest was perceived as a monstrosity so big that early medieval chronicles almost never mentioned it. incest was known in laws or penitentiary, but not outside it. In fact, the only known accusation is the one made by King Lothar II against his legitimate wife, Todberga. When he wanted to divorce her, Lothar accused her of incest and sodomy with her brother, and consequently of abortion. This is what is consigned in the proceedings of the Synod of Aachen, written by the famous Hincmar of Reims. In this text, incest is called an unheard of crime, horrible in its unspeakable stain. But the accusation was highly political, and it was a way for the king to ridicule his wife, now unfit to be a queen because of such a crime. But the queen's honor was then washed by an ordeal. Of course, I don't believe that incest didn't exist during the early Middle Ages. It seems more realistic to underline that we don't keep court documents which are used by historians for other periods. Moreover, the silence of the sources is not in itself insignificant. For the author of the early Middle Ages, who were mainly members of the clergy, the sibling relationship was an ideal relationship. Spouses could refer to each other as brother and sister, which is a sign of the abandonment of carnal relation and of great affection. Before the Gregorian reform, the sibling bond was not suspect. It was, in fact, the very model of a possible spiritual relationship between men and women. And I think that's why we can't have incest in the sources. It was unthinkable for those clergymen. Concerning then fratricide. The table on the screen shows that I found just 8 cases of fratricide in the sources I compiled. These ones are the real crimes, to which we could add 2 mentioned in the epic poem Beowulf. However, in the middle of the 9th century, Eudes of Glanfeuil explained that fratricides were frequent in the heritage quarrels, but as you can see, they are not very frequent in the sources. The rarity of sibling murders is all the more interesting because it is, I think, specific to the period that I studied. Before the middle of the 7th century, fratricide was frequent in Merovingian sources, particularly in Gregory of Tours. And for the 11th and 12th century, Martin Aurel counted at least 5 fratricides for princely families alone, and therefore he considers that it was not an epiphenomenon. Jonathan Lyon notes, however, that in the noble families of the empire of the 12th and 13th centuries, fratricide was also absent. More than half of the murders recorded took place after the middle of the 10th century, which should be seen in the context of the importance of fratricide after the year 1000 mentioned by Martin Aurel. The trend seems to begin in the second half of the 10th century. Moreover, fratricide is a matter for men, especially as the accusation against Adele of Ameland, who had her sister Ludgard killed at the end of the 10th century, is undoubtedly slanderous. The author Alper of Metz tries to show that Adele is absolutely evil, so she killed her sister. But even he mentions that even him is not quite sure that this happened, so it's kind of slanderous. There do not therefore appear to have been any female murderers of her siblings. The only female victim at the beginning of the 11th century was Ravenna, nicknamed Sigeza, who was killed while pregnant by her brother Peter in order to take her property. The unborn child was probably a threat to Peter's inheritance. It was the competition for patrimony that motivated the murder. One of the fratricides took place on the fringes of Germanic lands, the murder of Wenceslas by his brother Boleslas. According to Widukind and later to Titmar, The murder of Wenceslas was a proof of the perversion of the Slavs, just as Hermod's incest was a sign of the perversion of the Britons. The subversion of fraternal norms was a marker of the monstrosity of improperly Christianized peoples. Widukind insisted on the barbaric aspect of this murder. This hypothesis is reinforced by Bede's account. The 7th century historian mentioned fratricide in ancient times, but at the time of Attila, for instance, but known among the Christian English kings, and for him and others, fratricide is in direct opposition to the Christian logic of fraternity. Nevertheless, fratricide appears to have been a preoccupation of the elite of the early Middle Ages. Numerous works depict or evoke more or less clearly fratricide and reflect the anxiety of the aristocracy about the outburst of conflict between brothers. The fear of fratricide is of course based, among other things, on the biblical episode of Abel and Cain, which is regularly alluded to in early medieval sources. However, this episode can be used for any type of crime and not just fratricide. Although references to Cain were not always used to talk about fratricide, they probably did fuel a certain imagination surrounding this crime. Iconography echoes these concerns. According to Hermod the Black, in the 9th century, the church at Ingelheim included a representation of Cain's murder of Abel, among other Old Testament subjects. Maybe it looked like the graphic depiction of the murder seen in the Ashburnham Pentateuch, made at the beginning of the 7th century, which you can see on the screen. In the Ingelheim Palace, a fresco also depicted, I quote, how Romulus and Remus laid the foundations of Rome and how the former struck down his brother with a criminal hand. End of quotation. So you have to imagine that the leading figures of the empire, including the emperor himself, passing by these images of mythical fratricide every day when they were staying at Ingelheim. Although the Ingelheim sceneries has not survived, there are still images of Wenceslas being murdered by his brother. Wenceslas was the subject of several texts before the year 1000. One of his lives was composed by Gumpold in Italy during the reign of Otto II. The earliest witness to the text was commissioned by Emma at the end of the 10th or beginning of the 11th century, and Emma was the wife of the Bohemian Duke Boleslas II. On folio 20 and 21, as you can see, between the prologue of dedication to the emperor and the text itself, there are two images of Wenceslas and his brother. The first one on the left shows Wenceslas, which is on the left, and Boleslas on the right at the banquet preceding the fratricide. Boleslas is surrounded by his many supporters, while Wenceslas appears alone against everyone, but supported by the archangel Michael. The second image on the folio 21 shows the very moment of the murder. The characters are identified by name. On the left, Wenceslas wrests his sword from Boleslas, and on the right, Wenceslas, pursued by his brother, seeks refuge in a church, but the priest, which is an evil priest, is an ally of Boleslas, and he forbids him access. What is depicted here, rather than fratricide, is the martyrdom of a saint. In the second image, however, the clothes of Wenceslas and Boleslas match each other and help to create an effect of symmetry between the two protagonists, which is one of the ways used by artists in the early Middle Ages to emphasize the kinship between two individuals while clearly individualizing them. We can see the same process on the enamel of Macheda and Otto, who wore the same clothes. So, Twins, incest, and fratricides appear during the early Middle Ages as horrible deviances menacing not only the sibling bond, but society as a whole. This is due to the very strong idealization of fraternity, masculine intended. In deeply unequal societies, fraternity is the only model of equal relationships. It embodies Christian values, and as such, any deviation is considered as a problem. This explains, I think, the relative silence of the sources about these three deviances, which are much more visible for other periods. But what if we go beyond this very idealistic vision? I will maybe shorten my communication. Another element could be studied to show the real collaboration between siblings. The war and conflict could give very interesting information about that. And when we think of sibling conflicts during the early Middle Ages, it is, of course, the long and very violent conflict between the sons of Louis the Pious that comes to mind. However, this war occupied a very important place in the sources and appeared as kind of a distorting mirror of the reality. If we look at lower levels of the aristocracy, things could be very different. Outside the royal and quasi-royal families, where competition for power was common, collaboration and mutual support was actually the norm. It can be seen, of course, in several domains. For instance, I will take one example in the management of family estates. I will focus on the founding of monasteries. I couldn't translate the map, but I will explain it. Each item is a monastery founded by siblings in the spaces I studied. There are also such foundations in Southern Gaul, Spain, or Italy, but they were rarer and I didn't study these spaces. In white, we've got the monasteries founded between the middle of the 7th and the middle of the 8th century. In red, those established between the middle of the 8th century and the year 900. And finally, in black, those founded between 900 and the early 11th century. The diamond form represents institutions established by brothers and sisters. The triangle form monasteries founded by brothers only, and the inverted triangle by sisters only, but they were very rare. I've got more detailed maps with the names and dates of foundation. The distribution of the foundation is not in itself surprising, because the second half of the 7th century and the first half of the 8th century were the main period for creation of monastery in England, with the exception of Chartres. And in the 8th century, the missionary impetus in Germania explains the Bavarian foundation. And after a dip in the 9th century, foundation exploded in Saxony. It should also be noted that most of the foundation, 14 in all, were mixed and involved both brothers and sisters. However, their status in the foundation was not always the same. A distinction has to be made between joint foundation in the strict sense and foundations made by a man so that his sister could become an abbess. These two types of foundation are shown on the maps, but we could also mention family monasteries where the abbot or abbess enjoyed the support of their siblings. The strictly masculine foundation were rare in England and Saxony, probably because female monasteries in this area were very important. The institutions founded by both a man and his sister were in general feminine foundations. Some of these monasteries were in fact also ruled by siblings. This is the case for Corvey, founded by Adela and Voilà. Adela was the first abbot, but Voilà seconded him in everything, and he finally succeeded him. This was also true for Lastingham. In the middle of the 7th century, Ched, the founder and bishop of the East Saxons, had to go to court, and he entrusted the purification of the monastery, which he had begun by fasting, to his brother Thinibil, who ensured the regularity of monastic life there. And on his death, later, Chad entrusted Lastingham to Chad, another of his brothers. Almost all of the brothers, with the exception of the last brother, Cailin, were responsible for founding and running the monastery, which appeared to be a common property of the family group. Several foundations then were made by men who appointed their sisters as abbesses. These foundations were made both by lay people, such as Peterborough or Geseke, and members of the clergy, such as Barking. In the first case, the aim was to found a monastery to ensure the family's memory, following a similar logic to other aristocratic foundations. The founders gave their sister a specific role in commemorating the family, as others did with their daughters, for instance. As for Barking, founded by Ea Conrad, the bishop wanted to strengthen Christianity. He founded another settlement at the same time as Barking, no doubt in competition with other aristocratic families on either side of the channel. Unlike his predecessor, by definition, as a bishop, he had no wife or daughter. So only his sister was able to take on these duties and thus became the mainstay of his business. So far from being a sign of asymmetry within the family, the foundation laid by a man for his sister was a sign of complementarity and collaboration between siblings. Moreover, it is not impossible that the sources, which are very favorable to the founders, concealed to some extent the involvement of women in the foundations. For instance, Otto I's diploma on the foundation of Geseke showed that Vicksburg, which is a woman, who is a woman, donated property to the foundation in the same way as her brothers, even though she did so through her suicide. This close involvement of the sisters in the foundation, while not always obvious, seemed to be very frequent. So I've got a last point, but I will shorten it, of course, to not to be too long. I'd like to finish this presentation by speaking of royal family. As I said, aristocratic and royal families didn't function in the same way. Aristocrats cooperated with their siblings, but kings were regularly in war with them, with some exception. When the brother is a bishop of a sister an abbess, and the other exception is England. In England, indeed, the succession was more often brotherly than father to son. In the realms of Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, there were more brotherly successions than father to sons. I won't detail because I don't have the time, but how can I say? This preferred kind of succession created special links between brothers, and I showed example, but I won't detail, of a brother cooperating in charters, and you can also see that in bed. However, in England, the brother of a king was very rarely a bishop because all sons of a king could pretend to the throne. The only exception is that of King Eadbert of Northumbria and his brother Egbert, Bishop of York. But Egbert became bishop before his father, his brother became king. So they functioned as an aristocratic more than a royal family. And they issued coins together, which is very rare, but I won't have time to comment. On the continent, on the contrary, the brothers of king were more frequently bishops, whereas the link between a king and his lay brother was often very difficult. The bond between a king and his brother when he was a bishop was often described as an ideal. It was the case with Eadbert and Egbert, who are praised by Alcuin. But this is also the case, and more the case on the continent, with Louis the Pious and his half-brother Drogo, Archbishop of Metz. In the biography by the astronomer, there is this very moving scene when Louis the Pious is dying and his brother helped him on his dying bed. Otto I and his brother Bruno, Archbishop of Köln, are also shown by Ottonian authors as ideal, as a kind of episcopal and royal rule to Germany. And another example, which is less known, is that of King of Burgundy, Rodolphe III, and his half-brother Burkhard, Archbishop of Lyon, and Abbot of Saint-Maurice d'Agon. It's very interesting because these two are not known by narrative sources. There are no narrative sources in Burgundy at this period. And they are also, they are only known by charters. And Burkhard of Lyon appeared in 1/3 of the charters of his brother, King Rudolf. So that's quite exceptional. And even Bruno of Köln is not so present. Rodolphe and Burkhard also had another particularity, because Rodolphe used his how can I say that? Rodolphe used Burkhard's brothers, which are not, who are not his brothers, to his rule. As you can see, Burkhard's mother, Adjude, had 2 other sons by another man, Anselm, which is known, who is known as Vir Illustris in the sources. And these 2 men, Anselm and Burkhard, also called Burkhard, are not related biologically speaking to Rudolph, but Rudolph used them as he did with Burkhard. Anselm became Bishop of Aust, a very strong place, and Burkhard of Vienna. And they were Arch-Chancellor, and they intervened in the diplomas with Burkhard of Lyon. So this is a kind of extended family, extended group, which is very interesting to study, and which show the strong sibling bond, even between between people who are not, strictly speaking, brothers. I could also speak of the abbesses when there is no bishop, but it would be too close. And I will end to say that this was, how can I say that, a very short highlight of the things I said in the book. It would be possible to mention much more elements of the sibling bonds. First, the abbesses, of course, but also childhood, feelings, death, the implication of the sisters in the memorial, the consequences of widowhood, the conjoint management of estates, and so on. But it would be too long. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you have understood me. Thank you very much.